Okay, today we're in our 12th, 12 steps to spiritual recovery. We're in step 10, coming to the end of it, spirituality or religion. Before I begin, I'd just like to say thank all of you for hanging with us as we're going through this time of change. It's been one of the most interesting periods in my ministry. What I would also like to do is acknowledge those of you that are in our YouTube audience. And according to the YouTube analytics, there is 175 of you that show up every week. And so what I would like to do is invite all of you to come here on Sunday morning. I know some of you are in Italy, some are in Holland, some are in Germany, several in Canada. But if you don't mind, just get in your car and drive over, and it would be fun to fill this place up, which if they were all here with us in the flesh, which would be really wonderful, we'd have to bring in chairs. So I don't know if that's what our whole society is moving toward or not, is this, but I want both. I love speaking to live people, and I don't ever want to give that up. So through this whole transition, even if we are reduced to 20 people, as far as I'm concerned, that's fine. That's enough. If there's two of us, I'll talk to whoever's here, and we'll continue on with the program. But I just want to acknowledge you YouTubers and just say how much I appreciate you. I appreciate any of the comments that you send. I appreciate, all of us appreciate the contributions that you make toward this ministry, and we will continue moving forward. Okay, so we're looking at step 10, spirituality or religion. And this step involves, I continue to examine my old religious beliefs and seek to recognize them when they interfere with my desire for greater freedom. Let's speak these words together. I continue to examine my old religious beliefs and seek to recognize them when they interfere with my desire for greater freedom. And these old religious beliefs, some are good and some are not so good, but they can creep in ways that we don't recognize because we've held them for so long. I've talked to many people involved in some level of recovery, and there's often a little bit of guilt that goes along with that, because the feeling is that I have somehow let God down. I have somehow offended, a very high moral standard, that I've gone against that grain. Somehow I've been harmful in that way. And what that is a religious belief. It's not true. There's no way we could ever offend God. And as I point out over and over and over again, the prodigal son story is Jesus' best illustration of that fact. That little kid went out and did all the worst things imaginable, and the father didn't even acknowledge it. Even when the kid tried to say, but I did all these bad things, the father just passed it off. And that's an illustration of the nature of God in which we live and move and have our being. No matter how far off we get, we cannot offend how this universe works. We cannot offend how God works, because God is life, God is love, God is intelligence, power that is changeless. We have given God human form, and that is that's part of our religious training. So we always have to look at that. Am I concerned about the man upstairs, the old man in the sky, somehow? Do I think I've done something wrong where I deserve to have this roadblock thrown up in my path, and God's just trying to teach me a lesson? Am I treating God like a man? Because if I am, that's an old religious belief. It's not true. Jesus said God is spirit. He didn't say God is a man. He called God Father simply because he's acknowledging the nurturing power and force that spirit is. but it's within us. It's within every one of us. How could 4 billion people pray to God and expect an answer? What way would God turn? You know, and I've compared this to when you mow your lawn, how many blades of grass do you destroy? How many do you chop off? And how many healing circumstances do you create? But is that ever slowed down just because you mow all the grass in your yard, or because everyone in your neighborhood does the same thing that day, or everyone in the city, or everyone in the nation, or everyone in the world? If everyone in the world mowed their lawn at the same time, would your grass grow back any slower? That's how we have to think of God. It's not an old man. It's not a human being. It is spirit. It is a power. It is an underlying force that permeates us, and it permeates every blade of grass in our yard. And I think Jesus tried to point this out, you know, about the birds of the air, the lilies of the field, and all of how they are living in a state of balance, and they're taken care of. They have the intelligence to function in their niche in life, the instinct, the intuitive level, and whatever. And if they have it, certainly we have it as human beings. And yet we have this wonderful faculty called imagination, that we can imagine God is this angry old man. But that's not what God is. So that belief system can creep in anytime. If you have a prayer request, do your eyes shoot up to the sky? You know, do you find yourself reaching out? I'm lacking something. God, please, from your pile of good things, throw 1 or 2 down for me so I can have them. Or do you see this intelligence working through you to spark new ideas, new inspiration, new direction in your life in a way that solves your problem, that brings about the greater good that you're after? Again, spiritual recovery is not about getting something we don't have. It's about remembering what we do have, that we have forgotten. We own our spirituality, but we may have severed ourselves in mind and consciousness from that truth because we've treated ourselves as something separate from God, something separate from our source. And maybe it would be a good idea to even give up the word God, because when you say that word, where does your mind go? You know, that's why I really do like Jesus' definition. God is spirit. Like the wind, you don't see it, but you know it's there. You can feel it. And by feeling it, we're not talking about a bodily sensation necessarily, although it does include that. It's intuitive, an intuitive knowing. We don't see this power, but we know it's there. We know it's with us all the time. And the intellectual thing, we have to move beyond that. We have to move beyond how we've been trained to think of God and experience God firsthand. I love Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's always been a source of inspiration in my life, and actually a source of inspiration to the whole unity movement. He said, "Theological problems never presented a practical difficulty to any man, never darkened across any man's road, and who did not go out of his way to seek them. These are the soul's mumps and measles and whooping coughs." Theology is a word derived from the Greek word theos, which means God. And it's the study of God, the study of how God behaves. And when we think of theological college, for example, we think of a place where you go to learn how God behaves, and you learn all of the rules of the church, and you learn, you know, all the religious side of this whole spiritual journey. But the theological side has very little in reality to do with the spiritual side. The what theology is, it's like a word that has a meaning. But the word itself is not the meaning. The word is pointing in a certain direction. It's like, I can't remember the guy, the cartologist, the famous guy that did maps. He said the map is not the territory. You look at a map, it's not the territory. It's not, you're looking at a representation. And words are representations. Religious practices are representations. We talk about taking communion. So when we take communion, are we talking about going into a religious facility and drinking wine and eating bread? Or are we talking about what it actually means? Opening ourselves and communing with that one presence and one power. When we seek the baptism of the Holy Spirit, are we thinking of that as going into a church and being immersed in water or sprinkled, or have oil dipped, put in our hair, whatever, however they do that? Or are we thinking of taking time to be still, to immerse ourselves in the awareness of the presence of God and be changed by that, to be born again? Are we prepared to do that, or are we so connecting the symbol? See, there are a lot of people that if the Pope threatens to cease giving them communion, giving them the sacraments, it terrifies them, because they think that the ritual is the thing. They don't understand that the ritual is symbolic of the thing, and that no Pope has the power to take the thing away from us. And I think a lot of people do recognize that. But what I'm saying here is the religious side is the symbol, and there's not a thing wrong with the symbol. What's wrong is when we think the symbol is the reality, when we think that the territory is actually the map, when it's not. The map is a symbol of that. And so when we have all these theological problems, there was a big argument about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. At one point, I can't imagine being involved in that argument. But what is that? What has that to do with the reality? But it is a theological problem that was discussed so much so that it was centuries ago, and we still know about it. But it's never been a problem for me. I don't know if it has for you. If you lay awake at night wondering how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. If you do, you might want to give me a call and we'll talk about it. So the four Gospels, which are a religious vehicle, the four Gospels represent a religious vehicle that transmits many spiritually based principles. To glean these principles, it is important that we understand the nature of the religious vehicle. That's why I think it's very important. The theological side of religion is very helpful if it's presented in a critical type of way. In other words, ask the question, why does it exist? Where does it come from? Instead of saying, God ordained it, God passed it on to some very insightful people, and they passed it on down to us. Well, that's not true. All of theology is human construct. It's human invention. There's not one theological problem that's been presented by God. It is not, they do not exist. So it's important for us, though, to understand things like the Gospels. What are they? And put them in perspective. They are vehicles that have passed on some very important ideas to us, but there's been problems with that. None of the Gospels claim to represent the work of Jesus. That's something many people do not stop and think about. None of the Gospels claim to represent the work of Jesus. They are Gospels according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And of course, all of the Gospels were anonymous. We don't know who wrote them. The names were applied, I think, in the 2nd century or so. Their purpose is not to show us what Jesus actually taught. Their purpose is to show us how we are to think of Jesus. So as long as we understand that when we read a red letter edition of the Gospels, and we are assuming those red letter words are original to Jesus, it's not true. Some of the ideas that are expressed through these words are probably original with Jesus. But the purpose of the gospel writers was not to tell us what Jesus taught. It's to tell us how to think of Jesus. That incident where Jesus takes the disciples aside and says, who do people say the Son of Man is? And that's with a capital S, Son of Man. And they give off several names, John the Baptist, I think Isaiah or Elijah, one of the prophets, or some of the prophets. And then he says, well, who do you say that I am? And see, this is not a conversation between Jesus and the disciples. It's a conversation between Matthew and his audience. He's saying, here's how you are to think of Jesus. And how you are to think of Jesus comes in Peter's words. You are the Christ, Son of the living God. You see the difference. And when you really analyze this passage, it's not something Jesus would likely say, because he was not always calling attention to himself like this. It's a very leading question. Who do people say the Son of Man is? What's the gossip going around out there? And for Matthew to use Son of Man with a capital S is not a way Jesus would have used it. Jesus was a Jew who would have used the phrase Son of Man as a normal human being. In other words, Jesus probably in the more original context was saying, how do people define the human being, or who would they say represents the epitome of spiritual enlightenment? And they would say, well, some say John the Baptist, he was pretty enlightened, or Elijah. I mean, that would make more sense. And then for the second question, Jesus may very well have said something like, and I'm speculating, based on what I have taught you, how would you define the human being? And it would make sense that they would respond with, well, you teach that the Christ is in all people. Not you, Jesus, but all people. And so Matthew probably took great liberties, just like I'm taking great liberties right now. But if he could do it, I don't know why I can't do it. Because it's very misleading. We don't know, you have to ask the question, first of all, how in the world would Matthew know what was said? He wasn't there. His gospel didn't come along till about 90 AD. So how could he possibly know what was told, what was exchanged in that conversation? But he probably had some notes that were written by somebody, a collection of notes that had something like this in it. And so he said, well, here, I want my audience to know how we are to view Jesus. He was the Messiah, the Son of God. And so let's make this conversation about that. So as long as we understand that type of thing, and that is absolutely true, that the gospel writers were not historians, they were not biographers. They were evangelists. And they were presenting a narrative that they themselves created. And that narrative has been passed down to us as the gospel. But it's not the gospel of Jesus. And most of us don't really stop and make that distinction. That map is not the territory. It would be so wonderful, I think, if we would ever discover writings that were connected to Jesus or like Paul had a secretary that dictated many of his letters. It would be nice if we found somebody's writings that actually traveled with Jesus and wrote things down that he said, because I think we'd have a very different gospel. So in contrast, the message of Jesus was spiritually rather than religiously focused. This attitude is beautifully summarized in his statement, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." Very profound. For the Son of Man, the human being, is Lord of the Sabbath. That's the ordinary person is Lord of the Sabbath. And see, that's a pretty strong statement, and it tells me that a statement like this is closer to the original because it flies in the face of Christian orthodoxy. And they take that power away from the individual, the average individual, and say it's all about Jesus. But Jesus is saying the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In other words, he puts the individual, he prioritizes. Whereas the religious industry puts the average individual as a servant of the mechanism, of the organization. And we are to serve that. So we need to understand the nature of the vehicle. And as long as we do, we can put it in perspective. I used to, in my mind, argue with these differences all the time, but I don't do that anymore. I'm not trying to make Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John metaphysicians. I'm not trying to make them into something they're not. I'm recognizing what they did and why they did it. They were not interested in passing on the teachings of Jesus. They were interested in passing on how we are to think of Jesus. That was the whole early Jesus movement. There's really three periods that are important to think about, and that the first period is the actual life of Jesus, where he was walking the earth, teaching, healing, doing all the different things he was doing. The second period begins with the crucifixion and runs until the literature began to appear. As I pointed out many times, Paul was the first to start writing in about 52 AD. But Mark was the first gospel, and he appears around 70 AD. So that's quite a long period of time where the picture of Jesus that we have today was worked out. And the moment it's put into writing, it's solidified. It becomes a guiding document. So Mark put out the first gospel. Matthew and Luke came along about a decade later, plagiarized Mark, used all of Mark for their gospels, and it was not illegal to do that at the time. They didn't know anything about copyrights. And John, we're not quite sure. It kind of evolved, beginning maybe as early as 70 AD, but didn't really come out in its fullness until 90 to 100 AD. But there's an evolution of the whole gospel thing. But that evolution is an evolution of how we are to think of Jesus according to the church, religion. That's the religious side. The spiritual side was Jesus himself, what he taught. And that's the distinction I make. That's what I'm trying to pull out of the Gospels in my current life, in the study that I'm doing now and what I'm sharing with you, is there's a difference between what the man Jesus taught and what was taught about the man. And we want to learn to be able to tell the difference, and it's not that hard to do. Something's smoking over here, so it's important for us to, because we are on a spiritual path. It's our path. We're not on somebody else's. And that's what Jesus, I think, encouraged us to do, to acknowledge our own path. In this case, the Sabbath represents a sum of institutionalized formulas that are laid out for the followers to adopt and profess as true. These are not the natural promptings of the soul, but are the intellectually constructed doctrinal points that serve to define a given religion. Religions are defined by their statement of faith, points of faith. And if you adopt those, if you profess them to be true, then you're part of that religion. If not, you're not. But the spiritual approach has no such boundaries. We go within ourselves, we learn to have a first-hand experience with God, and that becomes our religion. Life becomes our religion. We don't adhere necessarily to a set of ideas that were given to us. But it's not to say those are bad. There comes a time when we mature spiritually to where we understand the difference. Let my own religion evolve. Let it emerge through me. Let my understanding of God be mine. So this is what Emerson says again: let me admonish you, first of all, to go alone, to refuse the good models, even those which are sacred in the imagination of men, and dare to love God without mediator or veil. Spiritual recovery is about the establishment of a first-hand experience with God. This does not require the belief in any religion any more than it requires the rejection of religion. As we learn what is spiritually true and what is not, we can see for ourselves any religious thinking that binds rather than sets us free. So it's a very important step, and it's one that tends to creep up on us in ways that we're not always aware, but that's the point of spiritual recovery: become aware, become mindful of what it is that is getting in our way spiritually. Okay? Something to think about. Thanks for coming out, and this thing worked. So aren't we happy about that? So we'll see you again next week. Thank you for watching this week's program. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with others. We want to reach as many people as we can, and we appreciate your help. If you'd like to help support this ministry, just click the donate card at the top right-hand corner of your screen. Your financial support means a lot to us. We have many subjects in our video lineup, so feel free to take a look. If there's a topic you don't see and would like me to address, just put it in the comment section. I'd love to know what's on your mind. To subscribe to this channel, simply click our logo. Thanks again for your interest in independent unity, and have a wonderful week.